we should ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a competent communicator? Well, I often think back at a famous quotation that kind of goes back some 20 some years ago. There was a television show called Seinfeld that was pretty popular with pretty much the entire country at that time. Now it's pretty much popular around the rest of the world. But anyway, back then, Seinfeld, who started off as an actual stand-up comic, used to have part of his routine that would always state, the number one fear in America is public speaking. And then we go into a whole routine on why that was important, why that was significant. I could probably summarize that entire fear of public speaking into something just as simple as fear of failure. People are constantly, catastrophizing over whatever's going to happen whenever they give a speech, thinking to themselves, oh, this is going to be the worst thing that could ever happen. They'll stand up in front of an audience, they'll fall down, they'll say certain things that are just stupid. People will perceive them as being really stupid, not smart, and all that. None of this is true, but that's what catastrophizing does, is you start thinking the worst thing that can possibly happen is the actual thing that you're going to end up doing, which rarely, if ever, ends up being the case unless you cause it yourself. And you cause it yourself by doing something that goes against my entire grain of belief of what makes a good speech and how you can make your first good speech. The thing that you want to make sure you never ever do is you let your audience know that you're having problems. So think of it this way. Your audience has zero idea what you're going to say until you say it, which means until the moment you open your mouth or the moment you do something or you write it down on a piece of paper and you show it to everybody, basically what that means is once you start speaking, you continue speaking, and you've had so much experience speaking to other people all throughout your life, which means you start a conversation, you've had many conversations with people. The only difference is you're speaking to one or two people instead of, a huge festival of lots and lots of people. That's catastrophizing, is you start thinking, because I'm now in front of a whole bunch of people, it's going to be a horrible experience. When in reality, that has nothing to do with it. Like I said, you've had so many opportunities to speak to other people, and I always tell people, think of it this way. If you're going to give a speech in front of an audience, treat your audience as individuals that you're speaking to. So you look around the room, you talk to this person, you talk to that person, you talk to that person over there, and that's how you communicate. And if you do that, what you'll find is your speech comes a lot clearer, becomes something easier to handle. And as long as you don't start thinking to yourself, oh my God, there's so many people, therefore I'm going to fail somewhere down the line, then it doesn't have to happen. It only happens because you let it happen. So my advice to you is don't let that happen. If you ever take a speech class, one of the first things they're going to start trying to teach you is communication models. And so that's the idea of where we get a message from, how we deliver that message to other people, and kind of what we do with it. So I like to think of when I want to send a message to somebody, the first step I take is I encode it, which means I take whatever idea that I have and I put it into a format that somebody's going to understand it. So let's just say that this is my message right here, and I decide that I'm going to do something with it. So I immediately encode it. Okay? So this message that I'm showing you right here is now my encoded message. And so what I then do is I send it to somebody. So I just basically, pop it off to them. And so this person receives it and goes, I got something from somebody. I don't really know what it is. So I'm going to open it up, and that's what we refer to as decoding. It's a very simplistic process for it. So person looks at the message and goes, okay, that makes sense. I now totally understand what this is. It means whatever this message says. We create all of the characters on our message with, you know, figures that we call symbols, and those symbols usually mean something to somebody. But in our situation, like I said, I originally put it like this and then sent it off to somebody else. They got it back. They looked at it and they go, okay, I've got a message from someone. It's written in symbols. So if they don't need anything further to figure out what any of this means, it's denotative. If they do need something, like say there's a primer somewhere that they have to look at it and go, okay, what this person was telling me was this, which means this. Okay, and so I put it all together. That's connotative. And those two elements together kind of create the entire journey of your message into decoding and then reading it and understanding it. That's how we like to consider ourselves sending a message to somebody else. I'd like to take a moment to explain a concept that is quite often misunderstood in speech, communications, and every other discipline that it kind of comes into, and that's the concept of ethics. Now, most of us, when we hear the word ethics, we tend to think of it as kind of like a morality thing, as in good versus evil kind of thing. And it can be seen as that, but in speech, ethics actually has multiple different kind of facets of meaning, and it's important for us to actually pay some close attention to the different ones that are available to us. When we kind of tend to think of ethics, we kind of look back to something like, either the Declaration of Independence, or maybe the First Amendment from our Constitution, and the idea that, we should have the ability to give freedom of speech whenever we want to give it. But then keeping in mind there are certain caveats to where you can't have freedom of speech all the time. Like the Supreme Court decided a long time ago, the idea that yes, everybody should be able to say whatever they want to say, but if you're in a crowded movie theater and somebody yells fire, basically the Constitution, at least according to the interpretation by the Supreme Court, indicates that you should not have the freedom to do that, because that will cause a stampede, and people could lose their lives just based off of somebody deciding to exercise his or her freedom of speech. So there's also what I like to consider is Aristotle's definition of what ethics is. Wrote an entire book on it, and the idea of it is again, we start off with the idea of good versus bad, or good versus evil, depending on kind of what construct you want to use it in. But Aristotle's approach to ethics was kind of like the Socratic approach to ethics, which is not only is it just good versus evil or right versus wrong sort of thing, but it's also something as simple as when somebody has like ethical standpoint in giving a speech to an audience, one of the most important things is that's the individual who should be giving the speech. So say I spent all of my life as a race car driver. I assure you I did not, but let's just go for the sake of everything else. Let's just say I did. And so that would make me somewhat of an expert when it comes to, race cars. And so if I was to give you a speech on race cars, there's a pretty good chance you're going to give me an ethical foundation of this person knows what he's talking about, so therefore he's worth listening to. Now, if I gave a speech on race cars And not having had those years and years that I'm kind of making up right now, because I didn't really have years and years of it, but say I didn't have any of that history. So if I gave you a speech on race cars, there's a pretty good chance that I don't have the ethical standpoint to be giving that particular speech to you. So, what would be my possibility and ability to give that speech to you if I didn't have that background to share with you? Well, one thing to kind of keep in mind is if I've done a lot of research on the particular topic, watched a lot of video, a lot of film, done everything I can to get as much knowledge as I can, that then starts to replace the years and years with an ethical foundation of, okay, I have enough information to relay to you that the information I'm giving you is good information. Now, part of the way that I would actually do that is to make sure that when I'm actually communicating this topic with you and I start talking about, say, an article that I went online to find that's, you know, Joe Smith's great cars they go really, really fast, okay, or something like it, whatever his topic is. And so if I've read that and then I'm sharing that with you, I would say, according to, Mr. Smith's article, the great race cars of whatever. I don't even remember the topic of what, or the title of what I was giving it, but I would quote the title and I would say, published in this particular date, the following was stated, and then I would state what I got from the actual book. That's giving ethical foundation to the information that I've pulled up. Now, another thing to kind of keep in mind is when we're talking about ethics, and especially when we're talking about in a school environment, is we have to mention, because it's kind of hard to not do so, and that's the idea of plagiarism. And plagiarism is basically taking somebody else's work and representing it as your own. And so a couple of the ways that this fails you when you do this is, one, if you're not actually giving homage to the actual original author or speaker, then you're doing them a disservice, and that constitutes plagiarism. So you can't do that. The other thing is you can't make up stuff. So if I don't have actual data to tell you that this is actually a situation based off of the evidence that I've gotten from doing research, then I should not be sharing that with you. That's not just plagiarism. That's just basically lying to your audience. And anytime you're lying to your audience, you're doing them a disservice. So you should not be doing that at all. Now, in every speech that you do, and this is one of the things that drives me nuts when I'm actually teaching a speech course. Well, when I'm teaching a speech course, is when I'll explain to my students, I need you to actually cite your sources, and they don't do it. And so somebody will give a speech on baseball and start talking all sorts of facts, but never tell me where any of those facts came from. What that generally means to me is they didn't do their research. And they're just either making stuff up or not paying homage to the original researcher, which then becomes a huge ethical violation. So make sure that you're doing all of those different things when you're actually doing your speech. And so I've already mentioned how you actually credit sources. And so those are a couple of the different variations of where ethics becomes really important in speech. And you need to make sure that you're actually following those rules and completing the work as you're supposed to.